making. In a moment, we'll hear presentations from two outstanding speakers. To my right here, Daniel Davies has an interest in the political aspects of non-nuclear non-proliferation and has spent time in Vienna with the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation. And more recently, he's been looking at this through an academic lens, having completed an MA in War Studies at King's College. And on my left, Maria Szczyglowska has a background in nuclear generation with experience in what may well be the technology of the future, small modular reactors. She's currently part of the Astute programme at Rolls-Royce Submarines, and it's great to see Rolls-Royce's commitment to developing a more effective working environment by appointing people like Maria to become a high-performance culture champion. Before we start, though, I'd just like to say a few words. On behalf of AWE and two of my shareholders, Lockheed Martin and Jacobs, I'd just like to say how proud we are to sponsor this conference. And whilst I am not new to defence, I'm relatively new to the nuclear side of defence, although it did occur to me as I was listening to the last questions, my first interaction with the media was in 1977 when I wrote a letter to my local newspaper about disinvention of nuclear weapons. I was 16 and somewhat naive. I applaud the efforts of UKPONI and RUSI to reach out to the next generation of people who will be needed, upon whom we will depend, assuming that the UK continues to support military and civilian initiatives in the nuclear space. It is clear to me that if we are serious about bringing much needed innovation into this industry, we need to encourage a much greater diversity of thinking, addressing somewhat challenging issues of gender, ethnic and age diversity in the workplace. So the way this works this morning, Danielle and then Maria will speak for around 10 minutes and then I will ask for questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come to you, and before you ask your question, please could you just identify yourself and any organisation to whom you are affiliated. And then just finally to remind what was said before, the presentations are on the record, but all the questions and answers are off the record. Okay, Daniel. Thank you.
So good morning. I would like to start by thanking RUSI for having me here today. It's really an honour to be here, although ever so slightly daunting to be up in front of you all. My presentation will examine the effects on nuclear issues should the UK vote to leave the European Union. I will avoid discussing the merits or otherwise of leaving and avoid speculation as to the referendum's consequences. I instead propose to examine that while UK nuclear policy is unlikely to change in the event of a Brexit, the means to achieve policy will need to be adapted outside of the European Union. The government will be forced to reach decisions regarding the continued relationship with the European Union. And it is the result of these decisions that will have the greatest impact on nuclear issues. As such, during my presentation, I will chart the decisions on nuclear issues that will be forced on policymakers. Following some context, I will examine the two main decisions following the referendum, those on how to substitute collaboration within Europe and those on how best to protect competitiveness of the UK's nuclear industry. I will close with a short overview of decisions taken by other actors that will also have to be considered by the UK. So, starting with the context. The first decision, a public decision as seen above, will be taken on the continued relationship with the European Union on the 23rd of June. The European Union emerged from three original communities, the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Economic Community, and the European Atomic Energy Community, known as Euratom, the last of which tends to be forgotten in this debate. Established in the 1950s, the six original members saw the communities as vehicles to promote regional growth, collaboration and security in the post-war era. Increased membership of these communities, including the UK in 1973, and subsequent treaties forged the European Union we know today. The Euratom community embodies nuclear collaboration in Europe. The purpose of the community, as described in its first articles, is to raise the standard of living and bring about the speedy establishment and growth of the nuclear industry. Thus, at its heart, the treaty promotes nuclear industry in order to support economic growth in the region. It can be seen as collaborating with the other two treaties in that regard. Under Article 2, Euratom was assigned 8 broad roles. Following a Brexit, the government will be forced to decide how best to replace these. While I cannot explore each of these roles in detail in the time provided, it should be noted that the competing national interests limited their scopes following the treaty's entry into force. Perhaps I could go a little bit more into that in the question and answer session. The UK established bilateral relations with Euratom in 1959, owing to fears of US dominance in the European nuclear market. This represents the longest formalised relationship with the European Union of any current institution. As I mentioned, the European Union developed from original communities through a series of treaties. However, while Euratom governance has been integrated into the European Union, it has retained its separate legal character. As such, you can see the turquoise kind of continues following Lisbon. I have seen it argued that the UK therefore cannot leave Euratom in the case of a Brexit, as it is not mentioned in the referendum question, and there is no explicit exit clause within the treaty as well. While the observation is correct, the conclusion is not. The 2008 European Union Act states that any reference to the EU in British law includes a reference to Euratom. It is therefore covered by the referendum. And moreover, Article 106A of the Consolidated Euratom Treaty, which emerged in 2007, incorporates the exit clause of the Treaty on European Union, and that it is therefore possible to leave. On leaving, the UK would be forced to decide how best to replace the roles previously filled by Euratom, and I have highlighted 4 of these above with reference to their position under Article 2 of the treaty. The decision to leave would, however, not alter policy goals. Safety and safeguards policy are unlikely to change outside of the European Union. UK policy cites nuclear safety as the highest priority, and it has been a vocal supporter of international safeguards. Moreover, while Euratom rules would no longer apply or be binding under European courts, other international obligations limit the policy vacuum. Although no longer held to the Nuclear Safety Directive, for example, the 1994 IAEA Convention on Nuclear Safety has similar provisions that could apply. Any significant change to the UK practice or domestic law in this field could also attract negative public and international attention during a period of nuclear new builds. Supply also need not be affected. The European Euratom Supply Agency was established under the treaty to conclude all supply contracts. It has that right to conclude all supply contracts within Europe. However, in practice, as the scarcity of nuclear sources feared during negotiations never materialised, the agency countersigns previously concluded agreements. And as such, UK industry could simply retain current contracts subject to revised trade terms. However, the government would have to reach decisions on how to maintain these policies. The UK would need to conclude a new safeguards agreement with the IAEA, for example. Currently, most EU safeguards are conducted by Euratom, and the safeguards agreement with the UK was concluded with Euratom as a partner. Decisions pertaining to the IAEA's role in UK safeguards, as well as replacing the reporting and material accountancy procedures, would also need to be taken. Furthermore, some nuclear products, such as medical isotopes, can experience periods of scarcity. The UK would need to plan to ensure adequate supply, mindful of Euratom competition, were we outside of the community. Euratom also facilitates a large amount of collaborative research and training within Europe. The government would have to decide how best to continue access to this research and findings for British scientists, as well as to attract grants for projects within the United Kingdom. Euratom, however, does collaborate with non-EU members in research projects, and perhaps owing to the UK's past investment in training procedure and reporting mechanisms, it may provide incentives for the UK to seek continued association in this vein, or in a similar vein. However, the level and form of collaboration would have to be decided upon. The higher the level of collaboration, the greater the applicable European regulation in the UK and potential purview of European courts. As the decision-making body of Euratom is integrated into the EU, as I said earlier, issues of representation, influence and funding would also complicate this decision. Moreover, partial membership can be precarious. Switzerland, for example, has had research funding withdrawn owing to a disagreement with the Commission regarding immigration. Decisions regarding competition and continued relationship with the European Union rather than Euratom also face similar problems. No campaign has advocated a complete secession of the UK's relationship with Europe, and as such, once Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union is triggered, the UK will have 2 years in which to negotiate any future relationship, subject to extension by unanimous Council decision. The results of these negotiations and future relationship with the European Union, while driven by broader economic interests, will impact upon the UK's nuclear industry necessarily. The UK's energy policy or climate change goals, however, are unlikely to change. The former is a competence of member states and thus not subject to European directives. With regards to the latter, UK legislation exceeds EU carbon targets. Demand for nuclear new builds, therefore, is unlikely to diminish. As is the case with Euratom, while negotiating an exit from the EU, the government will have to balance the benefits of a more flexible national regulatory regime and access to other markets against the loss of single market access that may come with pursuing an independent agenda. These debates will focus on the UK's future as a whole. However, given the neglect of nuclear issues in the referendum debate, it is important not to lose sight of the effects decisions taken during these negotiations may have on nuclear issues. Any loss in European investment will therefore need to be found elsewhere. On the one hand, the UK will be freed from EU state aid rules and challenges in European courts. Authorisation, citing and building decisions could also be expedited to some extent. Together, these could reduce investment risk and attract some of the £60 billion needed for new nuclear builds. On the other hand, investment from the European Investment Bank would be less forthcoming, including guarantees the UK has indicated Hinkley Point C, Wilfer Moorside could receive from the European Fund for Strategic Investment. Moreover, while non-European investment is growing in civil nuclear industry, current nuclear new builds still depend on European partnerships. The extent to which market access is retained will also affect the UK nuclear industry. While not necessarily mutually exclusive, the government may have to balance the benefits of pursuing trade deals outside of Europe, which may favour, for example, small modular reactors, against those inside the European area, including the decommissioning services needed at 50 to 60 European sites over the next 15 years. The effects of market access on current supply chains and supplies of labour for new nuclear builds must also be considered in this vein. These considerations, alongside reliance on energy capacity markets, clearly favour some level of continued integration with the European market, although the questions remain to what extent and at what cost. Nuclear issues, however, must not be neglected when striking this balance. And finally, decisions taken by other actors following a Brexit must also be considered. While not a government decision, any reignition of the independence debate in Scotland could clearly impact upon the successor programme and cost to the UK's independent deterrent. Moreover, on leaving the EU institutions, the UK would no longer be able to affect policy and practice within Europe. This has the twofold implication that the UK would need to consider influencing EU positions from outside, as well as that the EU's character as an institution may change. This could clearly change EU postures on a host of nuclear issues, which the UK would need to consider in the future. These ramifications will also be felt in Euratom. The withdrawal of UK funding and direction will lead the organisation to have a different character. How best practice is formed, which investment and research proposals are pursued, and how it competes with business and resources on the international stage will necessarily be of interest to the UK, especially if a level of participation remains that requires the UK to adhere to some community rules with reduced decision-making powers. In conclusion, while policy from safety standards to carbon targets are unlikely to change, the means to achieve them would be called into question should the UK vote to leave the EU. I have tried to highlight some of the decisions that would be necessary if this were the case. Broadly, the government will have to decide on the correct level of continued collaboration and how best to protect the competitiveness of British industry therein. Although I cannot predict the consequences of these decisions without engaging in speculation, I hope further research can be carried out on this topic, and I think it's very important to do so to inform decision makers should the UK leave the EU in order to better protect British interests in a policy area neglected during the referendum debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Some very interesting points and some food for thought. So if you can just bear in mind questions for Daniel for after Maria has spoken. Maria.
Very good morning, everyone. So thank you, Iain, for the introduction. As mentioned, I do work for Rolls-Royce. However, the thoughts and opinions that I'm going to talk about today are that of my own. So I'm going to talk to you today about the successor programme, more specifically the potential governance of that. First of all, I'll give you a very brief introduction, as I realise we've talked about this quite a lot in this morning's debate. So a brief introduction to successor here. So the current class of Royal Navy Trident-carrying submarines, the Vanguard class of submarine, is due to exit service in early 2030s. As such, a new class of submarine, known as successor, is needed in order to provide continuous at-sea deterrent. A 2006 white paper estimated that the cost of design and manufacture of the successor would cost between 15 to 20 billion pounds, with in-service costs approximately 5 to 6% of the defence budget. In 2011, the feasibility of the programme was approved at what is known as Initial Gate. The main project approval will be given at what was known as Main Gate, which is due to take place at some time in 2016. So, who is currently involved in managing or monitoring the successor programme in some way? Some examples are the Major Projects Authority, which works with the Treasury and other government departments to provide independent assurance on major projects. The Submarines Enterprise Performance Programme, which is a Ministry of Defence and industry partnership with an aim of improving overall programme affordability and collaboration. We then have the Ministry of Defence's Internal Investment Approvals Board that assesses the overall programme feasibility throughout the programme lifecycle and at Main Gate and Initial Gates. And the Future Submarine Project Team, who are responsible for the overall management of the successor programme. And yet, with all of this in place, there are still calls for additional scrutiny. In November 2015, it was widely reported that George Osborne sent an ultimatum to the Prime Minister, stating that he would support the funding of the next generation of submarine only if the project was given to a new body that reported directly to the Treasury, a body which currently does not exist. With the costs having increased from the 20 billion estimate to over 31 billion, with a 10 billion risk contingency fund set aside as well, and opposition quoting lifetime costs of over 100 billion, it is little wonder that the Chancellor wants to ensure financial success over the years between now and the early 2030 commission date. Some calls for greater political scrutiny have gone even further, with the suggestion of parliamentary votes of agreement being sought at major programme review dates. And yet, what more could be put in place than what already exists? And would it be flexible enough to deal with the challenging and changeable political and economic landscapes between now and 2030? So what is programme governance? For infrastructure projects, the project initiation roadmap describes good governance as the balance between the natural desire of sponsors to take control and the need for the delivery team to have sufficient freedom to allow it to manage the risks and meet the programme objectives. This balance should provide clear roles and responsibilities, encourage two-way, transparent communication, and have agreed strategic goals and dependencies that are well set out and agreed by all involved. And with 5 out of 8 common causes of project failure attributed to weak governance, I think that we can all appreciate that for a programme that could cost over £40 billion and run over multiple years, good governance is clearly going to be key. So are there any other major infrastructure projects that Successor programme can learn from? So first, we can consider the 2012 Olympics. The London Olympic Games cost over £9 billion, and with the construction programme completed on time, no major security incidents and no major transport issues, it was widely viewed as successful. Secondly, there's HS2, which when complete will provide a high-speed rail network between London and the West Midlands. HS2 is a long-term infrastructure project, with the last construction set to continue up until 2033. And yet, with much uncertainty still surrounding the project, increases in cost from 10 to over £40 billion, and the economic benefits being widely overstated, HS2 is maybe not one to draw any parallels from just yet. And lastly, we have Crossrail, which is the new high-capacity rail network between London and the South East. With a clear upfront plan and well-resourced public authority, this large infrastructure project has won many engineering awards and is viewed by many as successful. Despite the first station not being due to open until early 2019, the Crossrail project have recently established the Crossrail Learning Legacy as a way to pass on lessons learned. So it'll be this that I'll be drawing some conclusions from today. So first, if we just consider whether or not we can actually compare the two projects. So both projects fall under the Major Projects Authority and are subject to scrutiny from the National Audit Office. Both have major industry partners with which the interface must be carefully managed to ensure on-time and cost-effective delivery. Crossrail's £14.8 billion cost is largely publicly funded, as is the successor programme. And with Crossrail Limited, formed in 2001 and with services due to start in 2019, its 18-year programme is comparable to successor's 19, if we take that from the 2011 initial gate to a 2030 commission date. And of course, both have a wide range of stakeholders, both industrial, political and public, which open them up to much scrutiny. So this diagram here shows a very simplified governance and delivery structure of Crossrail, and has been cited as aiding robust delivery of a government-funded mega-project in a complex stakeholder environment. At the top of the diagram, you can see the two sponsors of Crossrail, the Department for Transport and Transport for London. The sponsor is the organisation that is accountable for making the case for investment, securing funding, specifying the project's outputs, and ensuring that the project benefits are delivered. The delivery agent, here being Crossrail Limited, is the organisation responsible for ensuring the project is delivered as per the sponsor's requirements. The key thing to take away from this diagram is the very clear split between the sponsor organisations and the delivery agent. This autonomy between the two allows the roles of both the sponsor and the delivery agent to be well defined and understood, such that the prompt and efficient decision-making can be done, while still understanding the accountability of each party. It is this simple, well-defined governance structure that's been pivotal for Crossrail's success so far. So if we were to apply a similar structure to the successor, you can see that much of the building blocks are already in place with things that I've already talked about, such as the Future Submarines Project Team. So at the top, you can see our single sponsor in the Ministry of Defence, with independent programme advice and assurance being provided by the Major Projects Authority, the National Audit Office, and the MOD's Internal Investment Approvals Board. I've also then included a sponsor board, which would be the key interface between the delivery organisation led by the Future Submarines Project Team and the MOD. I suggest that this board includes representatives from both the Ministry of Defence and the Future Submarines Project Team, as well as independent representation, including, but not limited to, a programme representative and also a representative from the Treasury. It would be through this route that I would suggest Treasury representation and communication rather than a board specifically run by them. This would allow the programme to be delivered by the sponsor's requirements, which would go above and beyond that of just the cost of the programme. I've also highlighted the requirement to have a Royal Navy representation on the Submarines Enterprise Performance Programme. I've done this to highlight the importance of including end-user representation. Ultimately, whatever comes out of this successor programme has to be fit for purpose, and as such, Royal Navy support throughout the lifetime of the programme is key. You can also see here the importance of having the Future Submarines Project Team is completely separate and autonomous from the Ministry of Defence. I'll finish on a few key points here. So regardless of the governance structure taken forward from the successor programme, it is key that a simple structure, such as the project delivery terms, can be well defined and understood by both the sponsor and the delivery agent, in order for both incentivise and also to hold into account the achievements against the objectives that are set out. This should be aided by clear roles and responsibilities of all those involved, including the industry partners. And as every battle plan is only good up until the first arrow is drawn, it is key that there is open and honest, transparent communication between all involved and at every single level, to ensure that the risks and expectations are managed and set to the most up-to-date programme landscape. It is this that will allow the programme to adapt to the changeable political and economic landscape that will occur between now and 2030, and ultimately aid in the programme's success. And lastly, I'd just like to thank you all for listening to me today and thank Rusty and UKPONI for the opportunity.